Good morning and happy Wednesday. We have so much breaking news that it's breaking out. What is it? June is busting out all over. Well, breaking news is busting out all over. Top of the news today is yes, indeed. The plan set out in Project 2025 to destroy and eliminate the entire Department of Education is underway. Linda McMahon, the so called Secretary of Education, is announcing cutting half of the employees of the department as her first step in dismantling it. And the deal is that, the Department of Education serves many important functions, both at the K through 12 level as well as at the college level. And the thing is, it would be really cool if they're going about dismantling the Department of Education, if they get rid of the people who know how to collect on the student loans. But don't even hope for that. They will make sure that they collect every penny from everyone in this country, or they will try, even if they can't get a job because of this Republican recession brought on by Trump, Musk, and his enablers. So that is the first piece of breaking news. And of course, dismantling um, education is part of the project. Now, the Department of Education isn't the sole funder for schools, right? States, well, in most areas, property taxes paid to the local city or other local government often get sent off to the state and then reallocated to the school districts. Not every school district or state is the same. I'm just referring to what I'm familiar with. Again, funding formulas differ. But at the federal level, the Department of Education helps supplement the funds to support often underserved schools, including schools in rural areas. Now, sometimes Department of Agriculture provides extra funding, as I understand it, for rural schools. It gets complicated, but shutting off that spigot is going to hurt local schools. And so, what's going to have to happen? The choice is fire teachers, right? Fire the art teacher, get rid of sports, don't turn on the air conditioning, no more theater, right? All of that stuff gets squeezed down. Or in order to fund it, there's only two other ways. One way is to increase property taxes if that's allowed in the particular state. There's some laws that limit that, right? So either property taxes, and that comes out of our pockets, or local booster groups, parents, local businesses. But again, the money has to come from somewhere, or the quality of the education will diminish, students will drop out more, and schools won't be a safe, enriching environment for people. So that is one of the top news. But of course, um, this isn't the only part of education they're going after. The reason why they're cutting back on so many universities, whether it's 400 million cut from Columbia, pretextually, they're blaming the fact that Columbia supports speech rights, that Columbia did not do enough to stop what was, I also believe, a hostile environment for many students there. But that's no reason to cut 400 million in funding. Now, let me just be clear. Protecting speech rights, that's the good part. Finding a way to both protect speech rights and make the school a welcoming environment for all students, that's harder. But why in the world would that justify cutting $400 million? He's doing it to control people. He's doing it for a bunch of reasons. But the bottom line is so much of this is pretextual. Again, we talked about this. They want to cut the budget so they can make sure they give their tax cuts to the billionaires, hundred millionaires, and corporations, right? They aren't going to be, if you have to continue these tax cuts and enhance them, they won't be bringing in enough money to support the existing budgetary items that we have, right? And what they're doing with tariffs, first of all, he keeps backing off of them. They won't bring in enough money to make up the difference of the incoming money. And then the outgoing money, they just want to cut, cut, cut. So the 400 million to Colombia, it's not just Colombia. Look at this. Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins plans to engage in staff layoffs after they had $800 million in grant cuts. Now, you might know Johns Hopkins University is one of the nation's leading health research institutions. And so, this is not just about funding, this is funding education, or we're pulling funding back because he doesn't like the ideology of a school. He's cutting funding that supports research, that supports so many jobs in so many cities. And it's just like a hatchet. And they don't actually care about health research for us because they presume people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk, just like they can get private security and just like they can take over government resources and direct them to themselves and their families, they'll have still the best doctors and the best research that they can get for themselves, right? Just like how private schools, and I went to private schools through kindergarten, high school, and even college. Private schools can provide whatever education that they want for a limited few, and public institutions, if they're starved, the elite don't care. This is what this is about. And let me just tell you more evidence on this front. Again, these cuts will hurt education. These cuts will hurt our health. These cuts will hurt future research. Just yesterday, on this point, our Secretary of Health and Human Services, yes, he is, it's hard to believe, RFK Jr., is addressing this major measles outbreak across the country. And instead of encouraging people to get vaccinated, the ones who have not, because measles is the fastest, as I have understood in reading the experts, the fastest spreading disease in the world, how quickly it spreads, or at least in the US, I should say, he's arguing incorrectly that the benefits of getting measles outweigh its harms. And he's claiming getting measles is better than getting the vaccine. Why does RFK Jr. say this when it's not true? Well, I don't know because he's a stubborn motherfucker and doesn't give a shit about anyone other than proving he is right. Now, RFK Jr. is claiming that. Well, it's not true because I was listening to epidemiologists on the radio on Sirius XM. So it was a television program explaining that the side effects of getting measles, it doesn't strengthen your immune system. It makes you more susceptible to other diseases, number one. Number two, how many people have to die? How many babies will be born stillborn because mothers get measles while their babies are in the womb? This is crazy town. And I just want to add, he also believes that even if you get measles, things like cod liver oil, exercise, and a better diet will help you get over it. Now, no, this is nonsense. But I do want to say one thing. The reason why people find RFK's views attractive is because just like everybody else in the world, he is not entirely flawed. He's just more flawed than most. And so some of his ideas are good ones. They're kind of like what Michelle Obama thinks. Eating healthy, getting exercise. We know that it contributes to so many things, including disease prevention. This is a yes and, right? Good health and nutrition are important, maybe even, necessary, but they're not sufficient. Similarly, just getting vaccinated is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the fact that someone in a position of authority like him will misstate information. And the fact that people who put him on the spot can't say to him, or people who revere him can't understand that the man may say some accurate things, even if some of what he says is so incredibly dangerous and incorrect. So that is where we are. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, people like RFK Jr., they don't care if we, the masses, get misinformation, get poor medical treatment. They don't care, right? They don't care if we are back to the industrial era where children work in coal mines if they're poor. I mean, they want to create, as far as I can see it, the very exact road to serfdom they claimed that libertarians claimed the existence of the state was creating for people. Now, I don't want to entirely, I don't want to entirely depress you. So I do have some fun stuff, fun stuff to talk about as well. I'm going to have Crazy Town, and of course, we are going to have our special guest, David Enrich, here today. So let me add, though, for you, um, just how much the Republicans are now beginning to admit they're going to cut things to the bone. They don't want to say it, but they won't deny it. So here we have on CNN Chip Roy on Brianna Keeler's show, and she's trying to say to him, where are you going to find the cuts? You have to cut Medicare and Medicaid. What these are programs that support us. Don't call them entitlement programs. They call Social Security an entitlement program. We pay into it. And even those programs that we don't pay from our paychecks or our taxes contribute only so much to. We are here to support each other as a society, right? The Constitution is for the general welfare, not for the welfare of an elite few or for the establishment of a king. Let's listen to this.
Get money
Do you
out of
really
the
think
Fed
there's
to fund
$700
them.
billion worth of fraud and waste in Medicaid?
Well,
$700 billion.
well,
I mean, it's the
I'm
cost of the whole
sorry.
thing.
This is Cassie Hunt. Sorry. Let's just start over, not Brianna Keeler. Okay.
Get
Oops.
money
Do you
out
really
of the
think
Fed
there's
to fund
$700
them.
billion worth of fraud and waste in Medicaid?
Well,
$700 billion.
well,
I mean, it's the cost of the whole thing.
Okay, well, Casey, let me give you a number that might mean something. The 2021 CBO budget baseline compared to the 2025 CBO budget baseline, a $1.2 trillion increase. Significant amounts of that is waste, fraud, and abuse. Significant amounts of that is illegal aliens. Significant amounts of that are able-bodied citizens as compared to the vulnerable. That's what we need to sort out.
Do you think you can
By the way,
cut $700 billion without touching law-abiding American citizens who are entitled to their benefits under Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid? I mean, do you think that's really possible in these programs? $700 billion with a B?
Yeah, well, first of all, remember that we've gone from $4.5 trillion of spending, Casey, in 2019 to.
Okay. I played at the beginning again because he doesn't answer the question. He does not want to talk about the impact of the cuts. He's going to throw a bunch of numbers around, talk in a way that's condescending, but he is not going to answer the questions that we know. We know what they're going for. Okay, because those would be unpopular. Now, let's get to some of the fun stuff. No, this is not yet Crazy Town. If you can believe it, Donald Trump yesterday was trying to bail out his buddy Elon Musk, and you see here he is standing outside in front of the White House. And the chyron here for Fox News is Trump saying, "I'm going to buy a Tesla." Why is he saying that? Well, Tesla stock is tanking. Tesla is a toxic brand. Tesla cars are called swastikars, especially the tank. So here we have Donald Trump pitching like a car salesman at the White House, his benefactor, Elon Cars. This is the richest man in the world. I know he's lost a lot of money, but maybe he still has a $500 billion. This is a multi-billionaire whose wealth is declining because he is spreading fascism in the US and breaking the law and is an unelected bureaucrat who is acting beyond the bounds of our Constitution. Okay, so people don't want to buy his cars. Here's Donald. They have one for $35,000, which is pretty low. That's what Trump says. This is during his Tesla promotional event with Elon Musk at the White House. He also said he bought a Cybertruck for his granddaughter Kai. And then after this show of force, so to speak, Sean Hannity put out on Twitter, as promised yesterday, I just ordered my new self-driving Tesla car that it goes 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. And he said details on how to win the Tesla of your choice. Are you effing kidding me? At the White House? I am old enough to remember when Carter, Jimmy Carter, who had a peanut farm, decided to sell it because he did not want to appear like there would be a conflict of interest. Now, Donald Trump is to help pay back the guy who gave hundreds of millions of dollars to his campaign, is trying to sell his cars from the White House lawn. And it gets worse. Obviously, this was a planned event. But Donald wasn't just riffing, he had notes like a car salesman. In fact, and I want to play you this Alicia Menendez panel on MSNBC about the event.
So Trump has this private Tesla viewing at the White House, and then he comes out, I need to show it to you, with notes as though he is a car salesman. In the Sharpie, which is how you know it's real, Teslas can be purchased as low as $299 a month or $35K. All cars have self-driving, just needs to be turned on. I mean, what does it say that people are currently freaked out about their 401ks, freaked out about whether or not they can go to the grocery store and purchase eggs, that they're talking about cutting Social Security, which, yes, I see you yelling at me on Blue Sky. It is not an entitlement. You paid into it. That is why you are entitled to it. And instead, what he's choosing to spend his time doing is a car commercial for Tesla.
It's just bizarre.
I mean, that kind of says it. It's just bizarre. But if you thought that was bizarre enough, corrupt enough, stupid enough, wait till you hear what else he was talking about at that presser. You know, Donald Trump is absolutely obsessed with, his new Monroe Doctrine, MAGA Fast Destiny, the Moron Doctrine, and he's obsessed with invading and taking over Canada, as well as Greenland. And so he actually said this. I got to share this with you guys. Donald Trump said whatever he says is someone said it first and then he just repeats it. But he's out there talking about the border between the US and Canada. And he said, when you take away the artificial line, like it was drawn with a ruler, and he's like, drawn, I got to show you the gestures. He's like, drawn with a ruler. Well, first of all, as someone who lives in a border state of Michigan, the part around Michigan was not drawn with a ruler. There's a natural border, and it kind of comes down. So no, not drawn with a ruler, but okay, fine. But still, most of it is, in fairness, sort of a straight line. He goes, when you take away that artificial line that looks like it was done with a ruler, you look at that beautiful formation of Canada and the U.S. And then he made his, shapely woman body thing, which is just so cringe. And he's an utter douchebag. Donald Trump, and I just need to say this right now, is a bigger douchebag than the character, and this is hard to say, played in season 3 of White Lotus by Patrick Schwarzenegger. No spoiler alert. I'm not talking about White Lotus, but please see season 1, season 2, so that you can see what a douchebag the character played by Patrick Schwarzenegger is. But as bad as he is, Donald Trump is grosser, much, much more disgusting. Okay, so he says when you take away that ruler line, you have this beautiful formation of Canada and the US. There is no place anywhere in the world that looks like that. And then if you add Greenland, That's pretty good. Well, apparently, um, Donald Trump, who is also obsessed with the southern border, had not noticed that the line between, let's say, Canada and Mexico or Arizona and Mexico, he doesn't notice that a lot of this, although some is the natural border here, right near Texas, where there's the Rio Grande, but he hasn't noticed that that's just a line. So why doesn't Mexico just ignore that borderline? He is an utter idiot. And this is where I will also show you. If you look where I am in Michigan, it's the Mitten State. You can see it. You can see how it's not. He's the ruler he's talking about is the western side of the United States. But come down and look at these lines through the middle of some of the Great Lakes and then down under Detroit and up along these natural borders. So he hasn't actually looked at the borders. He doesn't actually speak consistently, really, about anything. Now, I have, before David comes on, um, one last thing to share with you, and we will do, as we always do, we're going to do Crazy Town with our guest here. So, I want to share with you the press secretary who has gotten very upset because she is an idiot. And this is Caroline Leavitt or Levitt. And she gets upset because someone challenges her knowledge about tariffs. And the way they always handle being challenged is to act like a victim and behave as if it breaches some sort of decorum to fail to ignore the fact that they're idiots. So I want to play this for you because it's really hard to believe. And you know how many times we've talked about what a tariff is, right? We talked about Gloversville, which still exists, but is no longer the glove capital of the United States. And we talked about that the tariffs would be paid. Gloversville was trying to make its mark, fledgling U.S. industry, late, mid 19th century to early 20th century. And the goal of the tariffs for small fledgling industrial towns was to keep out the foreign competition, or at least make it so pricey, the gloves that came in from Europe, so pricey that the US ones could be more affordable. Remember, we were talking about that? So we all know that an import tariff is paid for a finished good, is paid by the business who's going to sell the finished good. We also know that an import tariff on raw materials is paid by, let's say, a manufacturer. So we've talked about this. It's a tax. It was the major tax supporting the United States. We talked about yesterday briefly that there was actually tax wars about whether we would continue to have high tariffs or we've been moving to an income tax. So it's a tax that is paid by businesses to the US government or any other government that imposes either an import or export tariff. So we literally have this moron at the White House still not understanding what it is or refusing to tell the truth. Let's play that. Here we go.
When President Trump last addressed the BRT when he was on the campaign trail, his big push was on tax cuts. He's going there today as he's proposing tax hikes in the form of tariffs. And I'm curious for why he's prioritizing that over the tax cuts.
He's actually not implementing tax hikes. Tariffs are a tax hike on foreign countries that, again, have been ripping us off. Tariffs are a tax cut for the American people. And the president is a staunch advocate of tax cuts. As you know, he campaigned on no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security benefits. He is committed to all three of those things, and he expects Congress to pass them later this year.
I'm sorry, have you ever paid a tariff? Because I have.
They
don't get charged on foreign companies, they get charged on the importers.
And ultimately, when we have fair and balanced trade, which the American people have not seen in decades, as I said at the beginning, revenues will stay here, wages will go up, and our country will be made wealthy again. And I think it's insulting that you're trying to test my knowledge of economics and the decisions that this president has made. I'm now regret giving a question to the Associated Press. Mary, go ahead.
Okay, insulting. So if she were a student in my classroom, and that happened, I wouldn't be rude. If someone said that, I would say, "Oh, I'm so glad that," and I call my students by their last names. I either call them like 'cause attorney, so I'd call her Attorney Levitt, or I would say Levitt. You don't let you use Mr. or Ms. So I'd be like, Levitt, I am so glad you said that. I'm so glad that you said that because so many people have the belief that a tariff is somehow a tax on a foreign country. And it's easy to be confused. But let me just clarify for you. And in fact, why don't you turn to page 27? Okay, do you see that? And can you read to me the second full paragraph? Just read it out loud for me, right? That's what I would do. But unfortunately, at a press conference, you're not allowed to do that. And it seems utterly, utterly maddening. Now, I see that David Enrich has arrived in the green room. So I want to set this up for you. David's latest book, and he has written, this is his fourth. His first one sometimes gets left off the table when people talk about his work. This is David's fourth book. It's called Murder the Truth. It is, yeah, I'm just gonna give you, oops, let me start here. This is the book. It's called Murder the Truth. Um, and I can't read anything that small, so I'm going to blow it up. Threats, intimidation, and a secret campaign to protect the powerful. And a little more about this. David was on Mata on Monday night, the day before his book launched. I don't think there is anything better than that, other than what he already achieved, which is getting, a starred review from Publishers Weekly, writing a series of incredibly fun to read, hugely informative, serious nonfiction books that sell out faster than eggs at a Costco. And here is what Rachel Maddow wrote about his book. She wrote, and by the way, I don't have to worship Rachel. I don't always do this. I'm just trying to let you know that, Gen Taub Live, we're getting up there. We're getting guests like David. Anyway, Enrich makes a compelling and alarming case that the legal protections that undergird the free press in this country are on a much shakier ground than we may realize. There's also, I'm not going to read this to you, but David was also on Fresh Air, not with Terry Gross, but with Tanya Mosley. And I want to let you know, I'm going to get back to this. This is when Donald Trump, before the last election or his first election, was talking about, opening up the libel laws. He's already signaled that he does not like bad press. He likes to control the press. And so it's no surprise what is happening here. And one last thing I'd like to share is just this clip of David of Mano asking him a key question, and here we go.
The legal protections for the press are so endangered. Do you think that there is a way to save the press and save these protections?
Let's find out what David has to say. I am going to bring him on stage right now. Hey, David.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. I'm going to fix my sound a little bit. So I see that you are flanked by two copies of your book. And I unfortunately don't have it because I have the PDF, so I can't show it to
Oh, it's
people. But
okay. Well, I've got them right behind me, so.
right, so there it is. And where, David, can people buy this book if they, let's say, don't want to support? I mean, I think it's okay when it's David's book to buy it from Amazon or Audible. But for those who don't want to, where can they find your book online or in a store?
Well, first of all, any local bookstore, whether it's a Barnes and Noble or just your neighborhood store, which you should always support. Also, bookshop.org is a good place to buy books online from independent bookstores if you don't want to support Amazon.
And
So,
I like that. Bookshop.org, you can be directed to your local bookstore, and it's really easy to use that way.
yeah, it's interesting. Amazon seems to, for a long time, they were selling books at highly discounted prices, and they seem to have stopped doing that, which is actually, I like everyone
Good.
else loathes to praise Amazon, but that's actually a very good thing for the ecosystem of independent bookstores because it means they're not just getting crushed on prices. It's expensive
So
to
I
make
don't
books. So
It is expensive to make books, every part that goes into it, including the
yeah.
physical book. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm Donald Trump at the White House pitching products. So let's move on to the content of your book. David, I want to say one comment and then we'll get into questions that I love this book because it's at the intersection, I think, of money law, power, and personal vendettas. And I would like you, I guess I've written down a bunch of different dates, although your book doesn't start in 1964. What I think I'd like you to talk about, and then I'm going to open it up for the folks in the chat for questions, sort of talk about why for 50 years between 1964 and 2014, this landmark decision, New York Times versus Sullivan, was this thing that we thought protected us, but behind the scenes, it was slowly being eroded and kind of where we stand now. And keep in mind that probably people listening, only some of them really know the backstory of
Yeah.
Sullivan. And then one last thing, the most important thing is, and I won't interrupt you after this, which is what makes your book a stunning expose is you found out something that no one has focused on about Clarence Thomas, which might be the key, and this goes to the personal vendetta, the key to why we actually may lose our freedom of the press that we have cherished for so long. So go.
Okay. So would it be helpful if I gave like a 30 or 45-second overview of Sullivan just as a starting point?
Yes, it's
Okay.
only
So
9:06. You've got till 9:25. So do whatever you want.
okay, so really fast. So New York Times versus Sullivan has come to be known as one of the most kind of important First Amendment cases, certainly one of the most important freedom of the press cases in the Supreme Court's history. And it started with an ad that ran in the New York Times in 1960 that it was a fundraising appeal for Martin Luther King, and it detailed all the ways that Southern officials were just acting violently and terribly as they tried to preserve white supremacy in the South. And the ad got a couple facts wrong, even though the gist of it was completely right. And one of the people who claimed that their reputation had been hurt by this ad, even though he was not actually named in it, sued the New York Times. This was a very racist, white supremacist Southern official. Sued the New York Times. The case went to trial in a courtroom presided over by, yeah, there's the ad. It went to trial in a courtroom presided over by an avowed white supremacist. And you will not be surprised to hear that the jury very quickly voted in favor of the white supremacists and against the New York Times. And the result of this case and others like it at the time was that it became financially just impractical for the New York Times and other national news outlets to have reporters in the South covering the civil rights movement, because basically every time they wrote about something, they ran the risk of being sued to death. Anyway, the case
And
of
I'm
Benton
going to
is,
stop you here, though. Don't rush
yeah,
too much because what that ad I popped up on the
yeah,
screen, that guy Sullivan, can you say a little bit why he was suing and what the mistakes were
yeah.
in this ad?
Yeah, sure. I was just trying not to bore everyone
No
because
one's bored. We have,
I can talk about this case for hours. So
David, our people, here's the motto of the show. The simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in a lie. Our mascot is a rescue tortoise. No one will be bored by these details.
okay, so to slow down and back up a tiny bit, the
Okay.
guy who brought this lawsuit his name was L.B. Sullivan. He's the Sullivan in New York Times versus Sullivan, and he was one of the city commissioners in Montgomery, Alabama. His responsibilities included overseeing the city's police force, which was, as many police forces in the Deep South were doing at the time, was one of the kind of agents of suppression and harassment of blacks and anyone else who was participating, even as the media was participating in the civil rights movement. And so the ad got, again, the gist of it was completely right, but it got some details either wrong or exaggerated, one of which was that the Montgomery police or the police had padlocked inside, basically tried to starve protesting students out at a university. That wasn't quite right. There were a bunch of little things like that were not quite right or were exaggerated. None of them changed the overall kind of fundamentals of the ad. And again, LB Sullivan, the ad didn't name a single Southern official. And so you would not have
So his
thought
name,
there'd be.
this is key, David. His name was not in the ad. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay.
Nobody's name was in the ad. The only names that were in the ad were the names of the people at the bottom who had signed on and endorsed the message of the ad. So there was you would think there was no cause of action here for anyone in the ad. And in fact, I think just if this had not been tried in front of a white supremacist judge, in front of a jury that some of them showed up in Confederate battle costumes toting pistols,
Oh my
I
God.
think maybe you would have had a different outcome, or at least a less speedy outcome. But literally, the New York Times pulled its reporters out of Alabama as a result of this case. The Times' lawyers urged reporters not to write about institutional racism in southern states. And it's not because, I mean, maybe you could say that the Times was being cowardly about this, but it was because the Times' financial existence was being threatened. And these are
Let me just be clear when you say that. I just want to be clear. Early on, after the case is filed, is when they pulled the reporters out, but not after
right.
the Supreme Court decided. So there's this moment of chilling of
Yeah.
speech because they're afraid of being destroyed. There's this litigation. Okay.
Yeah, and that becomes crucial to understanding why the Supreme Court ruled the way it did. So the Times lost at trial. They then appealed it to the Alabama Supreme Court, which not surprisingly refused to overturn the lower court's decision and the verdict. And so the Times' last hope was the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the court in 1964 agreed to hear the case. And the decision was kind of stunning. It was a unanimous decision that overturned it basically ruled against the Alabama courts and against L.B. Sullivan and in favor of the New York Times. But it wasn't really the facts of the case so much as the standards that the Supreme Court created that have left this really lasting mark on the country. And the Supreme Court ruled that basically we hold in this country the First Amendment. It's first for a reason. We cherish the rights to free speech and freedom of the press. And going back to our founding, it has been considered vital that we have a media and a public that is free to criticize the people holding power. And the reason it's critical is that the press is supposed to be a really important check on abuses of power by the government. And the court found that to maintain that strong, independent, vibrant press, you needed to give journalists and others breathing room so that if they got a fact wrong by mistake or got a couple of facts wrong by mistake, they did not run the risk of being sued into oblivion, because otherwise people would start to self-censor and just avoid writing about or covering powerful people, which was exactly what the New York Times was starting to do in Alabama as a result of this verdict. And so the
Let
Supreme
me just
Court,
stop for a second. So,
sure.
so before you get to the doctrine, so the philosophy backing the shift to expand protection for journalists when they're talking about a political figure at that time, for example, was to balance the public's need to know, to challenge the government, to participate in democracy, balancing that with any small private harm that might result from
Right.
someone of stature in the government having a fact about them be wrong. So that balancing test, the court decides 9-0, let's elevate public right to
Yeah.
know, public right to challenge, public right to get information above the small harm.
Now, right, that's exactly right. That's a very articulate way of describing it, actually.
Tell the
Uh,
doctor in though, because you said go where you want to go. Sorry. Yeah.
well, no, it's fine. That I think that was helpful in clarifying. So the Supreme Court created a standard that to basically to like weigh that exact balancing act that you just described, and it's come to be known as the actual malice standard. It's a bit of a misnomer because a normal person would hear that and think the question is whether someone's being mean or trying to hurt you, which is not really the point. So the actual malice standard says that if you are a public official or a public figure, in order to win a defamation case, you need to prove a couple things. First of all, that you've been defamed and that the underlying facts were wrong. Secondly, though, and more importantly, you need to prove that whoever published these erroneous defamatory facts did so either knowing that what they're saying was false, so in other words, they were lying, or that they acted with reckless disregard for the accuracy of what they were saying. So, in other words, the Supreme Court said that if someone's lying about you or being completely out of control, reckless, you can definitely, by all means, sue. But if the issue at hand is just simply whether the journalist or whoever else screwed up, made some innocent mistakes, got some facts wrong, but they're acting in good faith, you cannot win the lawsuit. And so that was quite a high bar that the Supreme Court erected. But it was a high bar for a reason, which was that, as you just said, Jen, that the Supreme Court was elevating the public's right to know and the importance of having a vigorous and kind of fearless press that would serve as a kind of a safeguard against government abuses. And so the case was decided in 1964, and it is not a coincidence that in the ensuing years, the press became much more aggressive at covering things like the lies surrounding the war in Vietnam, Watergate. The list goes on, but the Sullivan decision came to be known as just this watershed moment for the First Amendment and for the rights of the media and anyone else, because it does not just apply to the media; it applies to anyone who wants to say something in public. And it became a watershed moment for the right to express yourself and to kind of speak truth to power.
I want to say one last thing. So you are so good at explaining legal concepts. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, a First Amendment lawyer, but you could be. This is so helpful, David. And there's something else you talk about in the book, and that just building out this idea of the actual malice standard. The result is, right, that newsrooms, they do fact check. They take steps so that later, and especially if someone's litigious, I imagine. Well, first of all, if it's a non-public figure, they're going to be even careful talking about
Yeah.
a person at all. But if someone is a public figure, or a limited purpose public figure, they put themselves in the center of a controversy or something important politically. It's not like it's a free for all. You're actually worried about that standard. So you try to take the steps to check, to have another source to vet things, right? But there's this other thing that I want to back up into the doctrine, because you mentioned this in the book, and it's this idea of who has the burden of proof. So let me just say, people often say, I think everyone has heard the expression, it's not defamation. Truth is a defense. People say this. They say it all the time. If something you say about someone is true and it hurts them, they're out of luck because truth is a defense. People keep saying that. And I think you've heard it a million times, but I don't think people think about what that means. If I say something, if you wrote something about someone in one of your columns, David, and truth being a defense, who has the burden of proving the truth? Does a journalist have to say, oh, look, this is true? Or does the person who's suing for defamation have to show it was false? This is the whole ball of wax, I think.
Yeah. Well, prior to Sullivan, the burden of proof fell on the publisher, on the journalist.
On the
and that was
speaker, essentially, the writer.
Yeah, on the
okay.
speaker. Yeah. And and that was another thing that Sullivan flipped. It changed the burden of proof so that if you're the public figure, if you're the plaintiff in the lawsuit, you're the one who needs to prove that it was wrong. So it's basically assumed correct unless proven otherwise. Now, the truth is, and I think Sullivan was, as I said, a watershed moment in allowing the media to take on a really vigorous role, protecting, or a vigorous role, really, and as a truth teller, ideally. And that being said, there are a lot of weaknesses in the current legal system that have allowed, even with Sullivan and these great, strong constitutional protections, to allow people, especially people with a lot of money and a lot of power, to really abuse the system still. And so yes, the burden of proof the burden of proof falls with the plaintiff to prove that the facts at issue actually are false. That being said, I don't want to make it sound like the playing field is like tilted in favor of journalists, because I don't think, having spent a couple of years digging into this, the truth is, on the ground, especially in newsrooms or around the country, like smaller news outlets, independent journalists, like community news websites, they lack a lot of power, and they routinely find themselves coming up against people, whether it's the president of the United States or Elon Musk, or just like a local real estate development company or the city council or the cops, where the power balance is so skewed that they can bring lawsuits or threaten litigation. And even though we all know that because of Sullivan, ultimately this is going to get thrown out of court, there's no way they're going to be forced to pay damages. In the interim, they have to hire lawyers. They have to go through the legal kind of discovery process. Maybe they're getting deposed. their lives get turned upside down. And I've seen over and over again, and I tell a bunch of these stories in the book, where local and independent journalists get pushed to the kind of financial and psychological brink because of these legal tactics that exist even in a world with Sullivan. And so, and I think that has led to a lot of people kind of deciding not to cover or write about
Right.
litigious and wealthy individuals and institutions. It's kind of a form of like quiet censorship.
And so to this point, and this is how we're going to we can get back to Clarence Thomas at the end, but this
Sorry,
point
I
about
know you
no,
want to
no,
talk
no,
about it.
I don't want you to. I like to go with the flow here. So, and the
And I'm
biggest, I think
happy
one of
to,
the
by
big
the way.
what?
Sorry. No, I'm always happy to talk about Clarence Thomas. So
Yeah. So
take it where you want.
we'll get to, but you talk about Sullivan being better than before, but not perfect, and that's where we kind of get to. Is the reason why I say 50 years, around 2014,
Yeah.
when we start getting into the whole Gawker situation and the Hulk Hogan lawsuit. I don't want to give everything away. People should really read the book. You may know some of this, but there's this law firm, Claire Locke, that you talk about that decides to drum up business by trying to attack the First
Yeah.
Amendment and to bring cases on behalf of extremely deep pocketed people. So, if I guess what I would say is you can either, do you want to talk a little bit about that and then talk about
Sure.
Clarence Thomas? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, you mentioned Claire Locke. They were kind of the tip of the spear and pioneers in what was quickly becoming like a cottage industry of law firms and lawyers that were devoted to doing nothing other than suing the media or threatening the media and trying to help their clients, which overwhelmingly tended to be rich, powerful people with secrets that they did not want exposed, basically help them lean on the media or anyone else who spoke critically of their clients. And this, first of all, the people who run Claire Locke, Tom Clare and Libby Locke, are, I mean, I don't agree with their tactics and their stance, but they're exceptionally good, savvy lawyers. And
Right.
they represent clients with, for all intents and purposes, like infinite money often. And there are some exceptions to that that I'm sure they would be happy to point out and will eagerly point out if they watch this. But that by and large, they're representing clients that have something to hide and do not want to, they want to kind of have their way with the media and intimidate or threaten or sue the media to get them to shut up. And this became the successes of Claire Locke early on. They kind of inspired a bunch of copycats. And so by today you have, and this started in 2014, and over the ensuing years, you just saw more law firms being created that were primarily devoted to this kind of legal work. And you saw a proliferation of public officials, public figures all over the country engaging in these legal threats and filing these lawsuits that seem primarily designed to suppress speech and to deter or punish journalists and others who write critical things about powerful people. And one of the other things that Claire Locke was doing, and some other lawyers as well, at the same time they were bringing these cases and making these threats against journalists, they were also increasingly loudly advocating for the Supreme Court to reconsider or overturn Sullivan. And that seemed kind of like a long shot because Sullivan, for its first 50 or 60 years of existence, was viewed, it just enjoyed basically unanimous bipartisan support because the decision doesn't just protect like the quote unquote mainstream media or liberal media, it protects everyone who has a voice or wants a voice. So that includes independent journalists, it includes right-wing media, it includes activists of all political shapes and sizes, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum.
It
And so
includes
they're
me when I'm on Blue Sky, right? It includes all of
100%.
us.
It includes you. It includes anyone who writes a critical review of a local restaurant or circulates an online petition against a real estate development in their town. Anything like that. Those are all things that people have been sued for by powerful local interests, and they generally are going to lose those cases. The people bringing the cases are going to lose the cases because of Sullivan. So it is the Sullivan decision and then some subsequent Supreme Court cases that expanded its reach a little bit have they protect everyone. And for a long time, there was this bipartisan, near universal recognition that these were really important cases. However, Clarence Thomas enters the scene, as he is wont to do, in 2019, and he involved a case that it was a case that was not ever going to be heard by the Supreme Court, but Thomas took it as an opportunity to start attacking Sullivan and also to issue kind of an open invitation, basically, setting up a bat signal to get other people and law firms and clients to bring more cases that involve defamation, with the hopes that an appropriate case would land at the Supreme Court that would serve as a vehicle with which Thomas and his colleagues could hopefully overturn that
So
decision.
procedurally, you described this as there was, someone asked for it was to the Supreme Court to hear the case. And instead of this was the plaintiff in a defamation, instead of hearing it, they denied cert. They said, no, thank you. But
Yep.
he wrote a dissent to the cert denial. And it was, you said 12 pages or something like that? Like very lengthy.
Something like that. Yeah. It wasn't a dissent. It was a concurrence. So even Thomas agreed the court should not hear this case.
You're right. You're right. Okay.
Which makes this all the more ridiculous that this was not a case that anyone, including Thomas, thought deserved attention from the Supreme Court. And it doesn't even have anything to do with the merits of the case that was being brought. It was simply on kind of technical grounds that the person involved technically was not actually defamed. And there's no point in even getting into the details of this.
Right.
The whole other can of worms. But
read this, you guys. It's really very interesting, but we're not even going to talk about it because you have to buy this book. But anyway,
it is interesting. It's fascinating. And it involves a woman whom Bill Cosby probably raped and then smeared, but for technical legal reasons, she was not actually defamed.
Because she was a limited purpose public figure. We can get into that separately. And as much sympathy as I have for her, this was not the case to bring. But you said Thomas agreed, but then he took time to write this lengthy concurrence saying, bring me a different case so I can overturn Sullivan. Right?
Yeah, basically. It was clear that, so basically I wanted to understand why Thomas, after all these years of near unanimity among everyone, including Supreme Court justices, about the appropriateness and the value of Sullivan, what was going on with Thomas. And so I actually found that in his confirmation hearings in 1991, Thomas had supported Sullivan, and no one had written about it really at the time, and it had been kind of long forgotten in history, but he gave a pretty candid response in his confirmation hearings when he was asked about Sullivan. And he said, it's tough as a public figure when you were getting raked over the coals by the media. That's not pleasant. And he turned around, Ginny Thomas was sitting behind him, and he said, Ginny here told me that this isn't fair that we're getting raked over the coals like this, but I told her this is what the First Amendment's about. This is obviously not a direct quote, nor is that me imitating Clarence Thomas's voice.
This is 1992, right? You were saying?
This is 1991. So
91. Okay, got it.
And this is in his confirmation hearings. And so he gives this kind of candid, seemingly heartfelt endorsement of Sullivan. And then a week later, Anita Hill goes public with her allegations against him. Thomas goes through obviously a very grueling confirmation battle that really, and I kind of narrate this in the book, but it pushed him over the edge psychologically. He had a real mental health breakdown where his friends would find him, curled up in the fetal position, sobbing. And look, I'm not at all. Thomas is probably not the one in this situation who deserves our sympathy, but it is clear that experience was deeply traumatizing for him. And there's, again, that probably has something to do with him not behaving well in the first place. But in any case, he came to see the media in its role in covering the Anita Hill allegations as just this deeply destabilizing, traumatic event that I think really turned him from having described the media as this imperfect but important protector of democracy a few days earlier. Now he came to view it as something akin to a rabid dog that needed to be put down. And Thomas, and so I tracked over the ensuing decades, and Thomas's kind of the signs of Thomas's evolution in his thinking about the media. And so he would make public speeches where he would complain about the media and urge people not to trust newspapers and things like that. In his memoir in 2007, he has gotten to the point where he is not only complaining about media coverage, but he seems to be fabricating or at least misremembering these perceived slights that happened to him. And I went back and fact checked a bunch of those incidents. They turned out not to be true. And I don't know if he was lying or if he had just been so
He's
kind of
just
consumed.
exaggerating. It might be just exaggerating the trauma, and he's conflating situations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, although there was that might be a tiny bit too generous to Thomas
Yeah,
because
I didn't mean to.
I
As soon as
went,
I said that, I was like, yuck. Yeah, I know.
well, I mean, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but there was just a very clear pattern I saw as I went like case by case and dug into each of these examples, and none of them were right. They were all at best exaggerated, at worst seemingly concocted. And but in any case, Thomas still had not had an opportunity to weigh in on Times versus Sullivan. And even in 2019, when this case lands at his doorstep, it still wasn't really an opportunity. But it seemed to me, and Thomas would not talk to me for this book, so I cannot get completely inside his head. But as best I can tell, he had just reached the breaking point where he was so angry at the media, and it was just building up kind of a head of steam inside of him that he needed to kind of vent it out. And his target was New York Times versus Sullivan. And the opinion that he wrote in this kind of obscure case it was like the starter's pistol being fired. And it led all over the country to these. Again, he was not just saying, I don't like New York Times versus Sullivan. He explicitly said, please bring us a case where we can take another look at Sullivan. And so that, Thomas is a very influential figure in the conservative legal movement, and people take his writings very seriously. And so people who follow him and approve of him all over the country started bringing cases that with the aim of making it to the Supreme Court. They started doing academic and kind of scholarly research on Sullivan, trying to undercut it. They started kind of building like a philosophical framework for why Sullivan should no longer exist. And this ranges from like an individual FedSoc lawyer in Wisconsin to the Claremont Institute or the Federalist Society and in the Heritage Foundation. And it became plus like a whole band of lawmakers and lower court judges who were kind of drew inspiration from Clarence Thomas's opinion in this case. And so it was really the beginning or the culmination of this a legal movement that had been kind of percolating around the edges for a while, but all of a sudden was shoved into the mainstream by Thomas's opinion.
So before we wrap things up and we do Crazy Town, I want you to stay with me for that. I'm not a mathematician, but I can count to 5. In one vote, Thomas is less than 5. Are there 4 more votes that could push this into a dangerous space?
I don't know. There's at least 2 votes. So Thomas is one. Neil Gorsuch is another. He has also written a critical opinion calling for the revisiting and possibly overturning of Sullivan. And so 5 is an important number, but so is 4, because 4 is the number of votes you need to accept the case to hear the case. And so are there 2 more votes? I don't know is the short answer. Alito has traditionally been a pretty good on First Amendment cases, but also is aligned with Thomas a lot, and also has been increasingly hostile in public toward the media. So he's a possibility. Justice Kagan, a long time ago, before she was a judge, wrote a law review article that criticized or questioned Sullivan and criticized some of the court's subsequent precedents where they expanded Sullivan's reach. Kavanaugh, I don't know. Roberts, when he worked in the White House a long time ago, wrote some comments that raised some questions about Sullivan. Barrett, I don't know. So the short answer, I keep saying I don't know, which is a good indication that I don't know.
It's an honest answer, but we're too close to the danger zone is what I would say.
Well, also there's what we're talking about here is the question of whether the court would hear a case overturning Sullivan outright. And I think the truth is probably not right now. But I think there's an intermediate step that could happen that would also be really getting us into the danger zone, as you said, which is that they could take kind of start chipping away around the edges at the Sullivan protections. And one way they could do that, the New York Times versus Sullivan case in 1964 only applied to public officials, so like elected leaders, people in government, things like that. And then there were a number of subsequent cases in the years that followed that expanded that to public figures. So a billionaire, a celebrity, a university president, people like that. And so one avenue of attack has been, and I think will continue to be, to maybe narrow the circle of public figures, or maybe get rid of the public figure classification altogether. And so in which case Sullivan would only apply to government officials. And that would really hamper everyone's ability to scrutinize the activities of people who wield an enormous amount of influence in society, whether it's a really rich person or your local real estate development company, or,
Right.
like anyone else. So anyone else who's not
Right.
technically in the government. So I think that is a
Like
more
the boss of
likely,
a town, like the big, in a small
yeah,
town, the big business leaders and so on. Yep.
yeah, or like if there's a like some sort of scandal on your campus, like can you write critically about
Right.
that? I mean, there's a million different examples. Or if
Right.
you're just a private person who, there's a case I have a chapter on in the book about the situation in Wisconsin where a local businessman was at a community meeting and uttered a homophobic slur in front of everyone. The local newspaper eventually wrote about this guy having used the slur. He sued, and I mean the case dragged on for years somehow, even though there was ample evidence that he had uttered the slur. And ultimately he lost the case, but not before being nearly bankrupting this local news outlet. And that's a perfect example, because without Sullivan, if you narrow the Sullivan ruling to exclude people like that, that case would have gone the other way, and that local news outlet would have been dead. Anyway, sorry. I could, as you can tell, I could just
No,
go on all day.
I could do. So first of all, let me just thank you for this time you spent with us. Murder the Truth is critical, a critical read. Everything David writes, you guys, and I don't say this about everyone, I'll read anything. I love to read, but David's work is especially rewarding. I really love Dark Towers. I liked your book about law firms, and I'm forgetting Spider something, your first book
Spider
about,
Network.
was that
The
about the
Spider Network. Yeah,
LIBOR
it's about the
trading?
live. It was about the really fascinating guy at the center of a scandal who kind of got scapegoated for it.
If you want to go into the weeds, just buy all four of David's
Yeah.
books. Okay. So, David, we have this thing we do at the end of every show called Crazy Town. So just go with it. You'll see. Are you okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Let's do it.
Put on my music. You don't have to dance or do jazz hands. No one ever does.
Not gonna do it.
You're not going to do that.
No, I'm not
No
gonna
one
do
ever
it.
does but me.
I've had enough media training to not do jazz.
Okay. So here we go. I'm playing you this clip because this is Crazy Town. This is Sam Cedar trying to explain to some right-wing kid the facts that, government agencies don't pay taxes. And this arrogant MF just doesn't believe him. This is what we are up against as journalists here. And that is Crazy Town. David, any comment?
I don't even know what that was I just watched. That was funny, though.
Yeah, they have these
Is that for
competitions.
real?
Yeah, that's for real. This is what yeah, anyway. So David, thank you for joining us. Everybody, please consider buying this book. It's fabulous. And thank you for taking your time. Good luck on the book tour, David. And
Thank
I'll
you so
play
much.
you out with Crazy Town. Again, no jazz hands. Don't do it. Is that it? Oh no, gotta play it again. Sometimes it starts David again.
I'm still not going to do it.
I know. See, you can do all kinds of things. Okay, I will end the stream now. Bye. Thanks, everybody.